Hi, everybody. Okay, so in this video, as promised, I'm going to explain my alternative reading of Genesis 22, also known as the Binding of Isaac, which I allude to in the poem called Abraham's Faith in my most recent book, I Bought a Pearl. So I will come straight out and say it. I love the Bible, and I do think of it as God's authoritative word. But I hate this passage. I hate it. And I think the reason why I hate it is because it has been massively misinterpreted and used in very unfortunate ways. So today I'm going to address a common interpretation of Genesis 22 and why I reacted to it so strongly in my poem, Abraham's Faith. Okay, so first of all, what is this story about? The basic idea is that God tells Abraham to perform a child sacrifice using the one child that God had promised Abraham in his old age. His name is Isaac. And Abraham sets out with every intent to obey. So it's like a 3-day journey. And they travel out. Abraham like saddles Isaac with all the wood that he's going to get sacrificed on. And, Abraham really is like intending to obey. So he follows even to the point of binding Isaac and placing him on the altar and apparently attempting to kill him. So thankfully, an angel of God stops Abraham from killing his son. And Abraham looks up and he sees a ram caught in a nearby bush. And the ram gets sacrificed instead of Isaac. So God praises Abraham's faithfulness and obedience, citing that Abraham wouldn't withhold from him the one thing that he held most dear, his son Isaac. So a prevalent Jewish interpretation of this text is that God wanted God's people to know that they should not sacrifice their children, as people in the surrounding cultures were doing at the time. So I don't mind that interpretation. I think that's a nice interpretation. But a strange kind of spiritualization occurred somewhere that broadened the interpretation. And many people in Christian ministry may be aware of it. And that's the idea that putting your child on the altar can be a way of entrusting your child to God when you feel called to do something that appears to be on the border of harming your child. Now, I suppose that this could be kind of heartwarming from the parents' perspective. God didn't really want to have Isaac killed, but he was just kind of making a dare on the boy's life, like on the verge of extinguishment, just so that Abraham could prove that everything in his life belonged to God. Um, okay, so whenever Christian parents feel like they are called to something that could be hurtful or harmful to their kids, they can put their children on the altar, knowing that this is just a test of their willingness to surrender everything in their life to God, a test of faith. As a pastor's kid and former missionary kid, I despise this interpretation of the passage because it disregards the actual child that's involved. People like to talk about Abraham's faith without acknowledging the toll that it took on Isaac. If you look at the scripture, after this near death experience, Isaac is pretty lackluster for the rest of his life. The most notable thing he does is find a wife, and it's really his servant that is the one who like prays for it and like sets out a test for God to lead him to the right woman and does all of the seeking and proposing and arranging. And then later, Isaac makes the same mistake his dad does of pretending his wife is his sister and nearly getting her married off to a foreign leader. And he lives out the rest of his days in a contentious relationship with his wife and 2 children who feud over his blessing. Where is Isaac's extraordinary faith? In the biblical narrative, Isaac's main purpose was to be born, have his life threatened, get embroiled in an unhealthy family system, and then die. Okay, and he had two kids that the rest of Israel was branched from, but that's it. I think the interpretation of Abraham's faith consisting in his willingness to harm Isaac is flawed, or at least it's horribly misapplied. Um, so, God's test of Abraham happened once in a lifetime, and you see what it did to Isaac. And where I'm going with this is I think that making a practice of putting someone on the altar might have more deleterious effects. But first, in my poetry, I've gravitated toward the interpretation that Abraham was so shaken by throwing out his son Ishmael, see Genesis 21, horrific story, that he begins equating harming his children with expressing faithfulness to God. Notice that when Isaac was bound on the altar, God provided a way out, a ram in the bush, and an angel to alert Abraham to its presence. Raising his eyes to look at the ram and recognize it as the way out, I think, was Abraham's praiseworthy act of faith. So, what you're seeing in my poem about Abraham's faith is a bit of wild grasping for anything other than God commanding something so out of line with God's heart as demanding a child sacrifice or even a situation involving the trappings of it. The one thing that is certain in all interpretations of Genesis 22 is that from that point onward, the people of God are aware that God is not the kind of God that wants children to be sacrificed. But I guess the question remains, is God the kind of God that toys with a child's life to prove something about faith? And I find that kind of hard to believe. So forgive me for my grasping. I'd say that my poem is less a teaching than a protest and a lament and a plea. It flies in the face of the narrative that is so easy to believe as a pastor's kid, that a good and right response to the call of God could turn safe protectors into aggressors that are eager to place their children in harm's way just to prove their faithfulness. I don't think I can bring myself to believe that. Admittedly, it is the fragility of my child self's faith that refuses to believe it. So take my interpretation with a grain of salt. I don't usually make a practice of reading the Bible and because something is hard to believe, deciding that I gotta change the interpretation of the passage. But understand that in this whole process, I really am trying to find the truth in this passage. I'm combing through it and turning it around from all angles, trying to find the heart of the God that we say we know, God who's slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, God who gathers the little ones and shelters them, God who in the person of Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me." So to be clear, the Old and New Testaments both say that God commends Abraham's faith for being willing to sacrifice his son. I just wonder if maybe people have wrongly emphasized that part of the story, the willingness, rather than maybe looking at what actually played out, which was that God provided a way out for Abraham, and Abraham had to look for it and accept it. Now, think of the pastor's kids and missionary kids that you know. PKs and MKs often have a bad reputation for being poorly behaved, and most notably for leaving the church. But really, really take the time to think about this. Imagine what kind of life it is for your main calling to require continually being placed on the altar for sacrifice by someone else. And worse, what if they don't look up to see if there's a ram in the bush because they're so sure of what they've been called to do? What if Abraham had just been like, no, Abraham, I mean, Abraham, God definitely told me to sacrifice this child. So no matter what happens, shut up, angel. I am going to kill this child. Um, yeah, the story doesn't end very well. In any case, living the life of continually being placed on someone else's altar might just cause a person to start equating their parents' faithfulness with danger to their well-being. And I recognize that's likely not most parents' intentions in living this out, but it seems like a natural byproduct of being so mission minded that you forget to consider the effects that your ministry could be having on your kids. Sorry, hard truths. So, look, to my future and current pastors, I am not telling you that God will never call you to something that could be uncomfortable for your children and possibly even dangerous. It could happen. I'm just saying, look for the ram in the bush. Like, at least raise your eyes and look. Look for opportunities to alleviate the discomfort and or danger for your kids. You don't have to be driven by your children's needs in the sense of idolizing them to make a special effort to care for them, even as you are entrusting them to God and pursuing God's call on your own life. And maybe a part of your call, besides whatever people group you've been called to serve, is also to care for your kids' well-being. I don't know that I have much more to say about that. To my pastor's kids and missionary kids, I have two things to say. One, God is not your parents. Or maybe I should say, God is not your parents. Instead of allowing your experience of your parents to define your view of God's orientation toward you, you can open up directly to God and allow God to define what a parent should be to you. And yeah, you can trust me. That is really good news. Number two, cut your parents some slack. People make a lot of hurtful and harmful mistakes, even when they're really trying to be faithful. And that doesn't make it right. But if you go to God for the healing, I have complete confidence that it'll happen. Woo, getting emotional. Okay. Sorry, one more thing. Number three, to my grown-up PKs. A little individuation is not a bad thing. Maybe you spent your entire life on someone else's altar and you woke up one day thinking, this is junk. um, if that's you, I encourage you to explore what God is calling you to in your life so you can make yourself a living sacrifice. Sacrificing is always uncomfortable, but it does seem to be more life-giving when you can choose into it yourself. I wish someone had told me that earlier on. So that's it for now. If you have questions or concerns, feel free to reach out on Facebook or Instagram at Naomi M. Wong. Bye.